Got
Notification? I didn't,
that says Youri's recording the call or something
oh,
like
yeah,
that.
I see it, I see it.
Okay, perfect. Okay. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. Very excited about this episode because it's another one of our All Things Canada edition, and so for our Canadian audience and people who are shocked that Canada is very much like the rest of the world in belligerence and bullying, then this is going to be a great episode. We are joined by we are joined by Aidan Jonah, who's a Toronto-based journalist and also and also a student of journalism right now. He is the founder and editor of the Canada Files, and so we're going to be talking about all things Canada. Let's get right into it. So first of all, Aidan, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's an honor to be on the show.
Likewise, because because I discovered the Canada Files several weeks ago. Must have been a month or two ago. I'd seen past guest Eve Angler posting something, and then I started to check it out, and there was all these series of fantastic articles on Dimitri Lascaris and Meryam Haddad's run, the interview that you guys did, as well as the discussions you have, and it's just it's just fantastic. I mean, Abby Martin does the Empire Files all about America, and you guys do the Canada Files all about the Canadian Empire, and it's a very valuable. And it's just a very, very brilliant website and a very valuable source to know about all the things that Canada is doing in the world, right?
Thank you. Yeah, no, and I think it definitely the Empire Files was kind of like an inspiration for the name. I remember thinking about it originally, and I really wasn't sure what to go for. But then the Empire Files came up, and I still listen to that a fair bit. So basically, that along with some of the Grey Zone, and we'll get into some of my favorite stuff later. But the
Yeah.
Empire Files was definitely a major inspiration for the name of the site. Yeah.
Well, that's funny because that was actually one of the first questions I wanted to ask you was what inspired you to come up with the name Canada Files, but you already answered that. So, but then yeah, so my first question my first question is what inspired you and compelled you to develop and launch the Canada Files, which I mean there are very critical independent news outlets in Canada that expose that Canada is not the better version of the United States, and that Canada is dominated by corporations, two rival oligarch parties. I mean, there's Canadian Dimension, there's Rabble, there's Socialist Action Canada, but you specifically focus on Canada's foreign policy. So what inspired you to do this anti-imperialist website?
I would just say that basically I had kind of started to grow kind of a consciousness of foreign policy maybe like a year or two ago. And actually, I think this is one of the stories, probably one of the more interesting ones, basically, was when I was 17, I almost ran federally for the NDP, actually, in
Oh,
Etobicoke Center.
interesting.
And to be honest, I might have ran, but my parents wanted me to focus on university, so I didn't end up doing that. But I ended up meeting Matthew Green. And one of the most interesting things I ever remember saying is I remember one of the things I wanted to talk about was Palestine. And he told me this, and to be honest, I don't begrudge him for saying this because it's the truth. But if you're running within the NDP, do not bring up Palestine. Do not bring up Palestine when you're running. Basically, if you can get in, then you might be able to bring it up, like Matthew Green has done to, I'd say, a pretty solid degree. Though I think someone like Garrison should be ripped into by him daily. But still, point being that was a warning there to me, and I think that probably planted the seed to eventually do that. I mean, I then proceeded to go on to just do student activism and stuff over the summer, basically. But that was kind of like the first time I had consciousness, and then a lot of it was a lack of traction. I just didn't see the other sites. I just flat out didn't see the other sites, and I had just tried to go through the normal ones with at Ryerson. The Eye Opener, I think, was the one. I just had a frustrating time with the editors. I didn't have a great time with them, and I remember being told to try to...
Which outlet was that one again?
Sorry, yeah, the Eye Opener. That's the Ryerson's journalism newspaper. It's a school newspaper. Sorry, I should have added that context. Yeah, so basically, I just didn't have a great time there. I was told basically to change some of the wording around climate change because not all people believe that. I genuinely had that. And so basically, and then I just didn't have a great time there, and it was just a frustrating process. So I decided to start looking around elsewhere. Couldn't find anything, which is, I mean, I think a huge problem in terms of attraction of left media is basically once you're in it, you'll find it pretty easily, but it is hard as heck to find it in the first place. So yeah, I think that those were kind of like the major driving factors. And I mean, to be brutally honest, even looking back at it now, part of me early on was like, should I have just done this? This might have been less of a pain. But the more I look at it, the more I'm like, nobody else is really doing what the Canada House is doing. Like, that's the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing and why I've kept it going for like more than a year. It's just nobody's doing daily coverage of foreign policy, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think one of your contributors and sometimes when you do the podcast episodes, one of your contributors and frequent guests is Eve Engler, who's been on the show, Canada's finest dissident historian, media critic, and NGO critic, and I know that Eve was telling me when he first started doing critical history books on Canada's real role in the world, he would always find himself, when people, when he would engage with people and doing, book tours, that the other websites still cling on to certain Canadian mythhoods that that Canada is a force for good in the world, and that evil only started when Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau got into power. And then when people do speak out on on Canadian imperialism, they say that, oh no, we shouldn't be involved in NATO and we shouldn't go to war in Venezuela, but we should be part of, peacekeeping, and we should, be involved in peacekeeping and funding all of these NGOs.
Peacekeeping, quote unquote, peacekeeping. Yvonne Glair's written a ton about that, so that's probably his area.
Yeah, and then Eve was saying that even some of the best Canadian left-leaning media outlets still have all of these, mythologies in their head, including lionizing somebody like Lester Pearson. So I'm pretty sure that probably also inspired you, running into that same frustration and being baffled by that and the left nationalism that exists in Canada. That did that also inspire you that, like, okay, I need to just do a website dedicated to imperialism, so that people can stop saying, oh yes, we need we shouldn't be involved in the war in Iraq or Afghanistan, but we need to be involved in the peacekeeping in Afghanistan and the peacekeeping in in Haiti or Congo and Rwanda, right?
Oh man, yeah. No, I think that was kind of a part of the thing there. I think definitely a lot of some of the articles I've written, I don't think would have gotten published elsewhere. Like the one I did, especially on the whole basically smear campaign against the Hong Kong security law, which I co-wrote with Daniel Z. Basically, but like for example, in that whole case, basically, you had a scenario where basically the security law is put in place, and it's remarkably similar to Canada's actually national security laws. When you actually do an analysis of the two and compare them, but nobody was doing that. It was just hysterics. It was just basically I think basically one of the things I didn't start off with thinking about, but I'm very glad that I ended up kind of going on my own way and doing that, because I think a lot of the things I wrote about and I've tried to give space to write about, I don't think they get published elsewhere. I really don't think they will. So.
Yeah, it's it's a sad state of affairs because so much of I mean Canada is getting new into the whole speaking out on Canadian war making and the Canadian war machine and the and the warrior class in Canada. But even in the U.S., I mean, so many outlets which used to cover critically, uh, wars and the propaganda behind those wars have all completely jumped the shark. I mean, you have so many left-leaning outlets in in the U.S. that are for the war in Syria and for the whole responsibility to protect BS in
Oh
Syria.
man, yeah.
Completely jumped the shark on the whole Ukraine situation and peddling anti-Russia hysteria. And I mean, you just mentioned Hong Kong. I mean, even though I'm not a fan of of the current Chinese government or even previous Chinese governments, but the fact of the matter is, like, these Hong Kong protesters are funded by the National Endowment for Democracy,
Yeah.
and yet so many left-leaning outlets in the U.S. and across Europe are all gung ho for the Hong Kong protests.
Oh yeah, no, it's one of the most frustrating instances I've really found. Yeah, no, it's something that definitely makes me grateful, really, that I did end up starting the site and that there has been at least a decent following there, because I think basically, yeah, especially something like Syria. I mean, like the gray zone is something that I'm definitely very grateful to, because I
Yeah.
think a lot of the political development that I had, I don't think that happens without running into their content and kind of like learning a lot. Basically, I think a lot of the ethos that they have there is kind of what I took onto the Canada Files in terms of
Mm-hmm.
just being really, really rigorous with sourcing and a lot of these key things that might actually give you a chance to win over skeptical people. Like in terms of Xinjiang and a lot of these Hong Kong, a lot of these basically issues, really, it was their reporting, their original reporting, that kind of made the difference in terms of getting me the facts and getting me these things. Because I've always been a big person, basically. Like if you have evidence and facts on your side, and these facts don't come from like think tanks you fund, then I'll listen. I'll give it a chance. So.
Mm-hmm. And and then actually, and then speaking of that, I mean, actually, continuing on with what you were saying about that, do you, my second question was, do you think the anti-war, anti-imperialist movement is weaker in Canada, and why do you think, and why, and if so, why do you think that is? That propaganda is, seems to be much more excessive and much more sophisticated in Canada compared to the U.S. or or Brits, and does the sort of narrow left nationalism in Canada play a huge role in why so much of the left leaning outlets in Canada are either don't cover foreign policy enough, or if they do, it's almost recycled garbage of insincere NGOs and what the current government of Canada and the NDP leadership is peddling.
Yeah, I find the biggest thing, I think the problem in terms of why the Canadian anti-war left is so weak is, I think, because a lot of the left has decided to go within the NDP. And I'll be honest, I went within the NDP myself. I mean, like when I was a student activist, right after then, I jumped into basically the NDP, that kind of space. I mean, I was even in the Writing Association, spent out of Fort York provincially for 7 months. And basically, I just got really disillusioned by the end, basically, because I remember having basically multi-hour discussions, multi-hour debates, really firm debates, trying to get them to even just be more brave to talk about foreign policy, to talk about some of these things. And I got absolutely nowhere. It's basically, I just really found it to be such a frustrating place to be in. And I think there's definitely positive figures. I think someone like Matthew Green, who, even if I think he should be going after Garrison harder for support for pushing the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism on social media and trying to push that there, basically, I still think he does a good job overall And to be brutally honest, I'd kind of wish he would go to like the Communist Party, and that's where I am right now. And I think basically if you can build the Communist Party, I'm part of the Communist Party.
Which party is that?
Sorry, yeah. So I'm part of the Young Communist League. I'm gonna officially be part of it in January because you have to go to 3 meetings and then basically get confirmed then. So that confirmation will happen in January. So I'll be part of that officially in January, but that's where I've been kind of a part of politically. Like I admittedly had the last kind of flirtations with social democracy. I would say in the Lascaris and Haddad campaign. It was kind of me being like, okay, maybe it's just the NDP, maybe there's an option there. But then once I saw the rigging and the stuff that happened there, and also just the foreign policy debate. It was watching the foreign policy debate. I was like, what the hell? This is garbage. Like every single one of the people here is garbage. Like Lascaris was maybe passable, but it was still garbage. That was the point where I was like, okay, these social democrats aren't gonna social democrats are social imperialists in my opinion. Basically,
exactly.
Like social democracy doesn't work unless you really kind of colonize or use neocolonialism against basically quote unquote third world nations, or basically the global south. So yeah, no, I just really think in the end of the day, basically this attachment to the NDP, this attachment to social democratic parties is really a major role. But I think like you see activism like the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, which are obviously Yvonne Glaire and Arnold August, who are the 2 co-hosts of the podcast. They're fellows at that institute, and basically that's a really great one, doing good work to try to connect there. But yeah, it's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of work to build it up, really. And I mean, it was one of the interesting things when I was talking to Ethan Cox of Ricochet for it was like a school article, but one of the interesting things he said was basically that the articles on foreign policy don't do that well. They don't do that well view-wise. It's like people don't seem to care as much about that. Basically, that was one of the most interesting things I got from him. So basically, part of the work the Canada Files is doing, and along with some of the Foreign Policy Institute and some of the left activists and communist activists who basically are trying to make people realize that Canada has an imperialist foreign policy, and most importantly of all, that Canada makes its own imperialist foreign policy. It's not we're just beacons of the U.S. No, screw that. That is apologism for imperialism. It's simple as that. Basically, Canada has its own damn foreign policy, and it's a terrible one. So.
And evil did not start with Stephen Harper and Justin Trudeau. This evil has been existing in Canada since the country was stolen from the Indigenous people.
Colonialism, genocide. We're still doing that. And there's firm resistance from Indigenous nations. They are firmly resisting. They're not taking this lying down. But basically, we are doing colonialism. We are doing genocide against them to this very day. Like, for example, the water boil advisories. Trudeau won't commit to a day to end that. I mean, it's not insanity. It's not the system's broken. This is how the system is designed. This is how capitalism is designed. It really is designed to systematically crush resistance. And I really, really hate when people say, oh, the system's broken, or mainly social democrats or these left liberals or rad libs are basically like, oh, just work within the structures, work within these things, keep doing the same thing that failed for 50 damn years. Just keep banging your head against the wall till you're bloody, you're knocked out, and you're dead. And don't worry, the next person that does it will die too, but just keep going. Don't look at the situation. Don't assess past failures. Don't look at the fact that when the NDP even had a somewhat insurgent left movement with the Waffle, they got kicked the hell out of the party. Basically, like, the NDP removed socialism from their platform in 2013. And quite frankly, it was gone since maybe the 80s or 70s, really. And even then, I saw basically not a long time ago, but the CCF was even built in anti-communist roots, really. And so basically, this glorification of, the CCF is still anti-communist. It's still anti-communist, even that. So basically, you just have a left that's not learning from its historical lessons. And I think until it starts to learn these lessons, I don't think this will change. And I don't really have too much sympathy for people that are struggling to take DL per se, or that, because I had to take DL. Look, I went from, I remember when I was 15, basically, I came from a kind of a lib left family, mild social democrats maybe, basically. So I volunteered for freaking liberals when I was 15, basically, my local as Etobicoke Center, because I didn't know any better. But like, so you see, like, then I went to the NDP. I took my L. I tried the Greens. I took my L, and so I'm finally at a place where I'm happy with the policy. I'm happy with basically what they stand for in terms of anti-imperialism and their policies. But it's one of the few places where I'm actually learning stuff. I'm learning stuff from people, and that's where I say that I don't have much sympathy for people who can't take these losses and can't get over themselves and just admit that maybe they were wrong to support these parties or work within them, because I had to do that too, basically. And it sucks. It sucks to admit, hey, I was wrong, but it's sure as hell, it's better to feel like you're in the right way and you're supporting the right causes and you're actually being like a socialist and an anti-imperialist than just basically continuing to screw up and feel sorry for yourself.
Yeah, it's quite baffling, and it's certainly an issue that I've been. I mean, in the U.S., I definitely do not support the taking over the Democrats and trying to do like a left Tea Party or like a
oh
left
man,
Trump
they're so
delusional
there. They're so delusional.
In the and it's the same problem in the UK. You have people, despite the fact that Jeremy Corbyn had his hands tied behind his back, and the fact that like Jeremy Corbyn himself threw his own people power movement under the bus, and when he was being smeared and his comrades and the entire movement behind him was being slandered as anti-Semites, you had Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, and his entire leadership going, yes, there's an anti-Semitism crisis, we're dealing with it, giving all the ammunition their opponents within Labour and within the entire British establishment needed to smear them until they were broken. And still you find people who say, we need to stay in the Labour Party and we need to transform the Labour Party, when it's like, dudes, the Labour Party was always like a right-wing, like ultra-Zionist, racist, imperialist party, and Jeremy Corbyn himself has just been kicked out of the party from the guy Keir Starmer, who Jeremy Corbyn himself brought into the party, made Brexit secretary, and now you guys still like don't like get this idea that like you need to seriously abandon the Labour Party. You should have never like devoted your lives to the Labour Party, and it's just. Yeah, it's just it's seriously it's very mind baffling. I don't get it. I honestly don't get why people do this to themselves.
Oh yeah, no, I think it's because we really are kind of like, I'd say, brainwashed by the media. Like, you really have a media class in this country that manufactures consent. And honestly, I don't think Chomsky is that great, really. I think he's kind of more of a rad-lib, but he was right on the media. I think basically that it was a lot of financial incentives. I mean, there also is a core of basically just supporting imperialism inherently and supporting the status quo. But basically this idea, the media does manufacture consent for these wars and manufactures consent to the NDP.
So you think the Chomsky book, the Chomsky Herman book, and I even do have a copy of it, Manufacturing Consent. So for people who say that like Canada's media is not like the United States, heavily concentrated by the 1%ers, or it's not like the barely unreadable, unwatchable media of Britain. So you definitely think that like that that you can definitely apply that argument of manufacturing consent and what the two British gentlemen's media lens have done in England, that you can definitely take the propaganda model of Chomsky and Herman and apply it to Canada.
Oh, I think there's no doubt. I mean, like, even like you look at what they did to the mildest of social democrats in like Lascaris and Haddad. Really, basically, Lascaris got smeared as an anti-Semite in Global News. There's a reply article, basically an op-ed penned by a Justice Greens member, basically condemning that at the time. Basically, like, we've seen this in time, basically, where anybody who challenges the status quo in the slightest, remotest way will get systematically crushed and destroyed. And like, this is, I think that was like the first, I think, hint for me where I began to escape social democracy and basically come to being a communist. Basically, was actually realizing that the basically ideology was inherently incapable of basically dispelling capital and actually giving control of either means of production and these things to people. And so I think, in terms of, I guess this is a different point, but I think it was going into like the Young Communist League, or going into the party apparatus in general of the Communist Party. I think it really was natural, basically. But I think, for example, I'm one of the examples of basically people really where you kind of got consent manufacturing. I mean, bloody hell, I read the Gorbachev book, basically about how he was some great hero and how he had the collapse of the Soviet Union and how he'd done it in a great way and that how people were fine and basically things had gone well and that he was still well respected and basically all that shit. And basically, and when you look at it, when you look at the reality, you see mortality rates drastically climb. You basically see shock doctrines happening all over Europe. You see communist parties and stuff banned basically from elections. And it's really, I mean, the USSR's collapse is the great example of capitalism's failure because you looked at how well basically the Soviet Union held up against imperialist aggression for decades, really. And then basically you have basically the Soviet Union essentially in Gorbachev and the leadership there really that essentially sabotaged it intentionally or unintentionally. I mean, Yeltsin intentionally, let's be real here. But Gorbachev, I think, was more stupid than evil. I really don't think he was inherently like, I want to destroy the Soviet Union, but his actions destroyed the Soviet Union. And so basically, yeah, you have a case where the collapse of socialism kind of really, a lot of people try to say, oh, the USSR failed. No, basically, the USSR didn't fail. It was sabotaged from the inside. And basically, it's the greatest example of why socialism works because look at what happened after.
Interesting. I definitely need to have you back on the show to talk about that because I think that's where we can have a good conversation about Michael Parenti. So I'm definitely gonna.
Oh, I love Parenti. Parenti was such key. Parenti, I love Parenti to bits. This guy is amazing.
But sort of going back to what you were saying about how you can apply Chomsky and Herman's propaganda model into Canada. I mean, well, I'm pretty sure if I was to go to Canada and I bought myself a copy of the Globe and Mail, bought myself a copy of the Toronto Star, bought myself a copy of the National Post, and then you read it, and you're going to see tons of corporate advertisements. And then even if you're not and even if you're not that well in tune into Canadian politics, everybody's basically propping up liberal democracies. And I had Jay Watts, the central organizer of the Communist Party, on the program, and he was explaining to me and the audience how liberal, democracies, are. Yeah, liberal democracies are a joke. Social democracies are a joke because in the end of the day, when it comes to the unfair classist economic system of the rival oligarchs and real democracy, which addresses the needs and the grievances of the working class, liberal democracies and social democracies within the liberal democracies are always going to favor the 1%. And the times I have read, Canadian, the times I've watched or read, Canadian corporate media outlets or state media outlets like, the CBC. I mean, as you mentioned, they're maybe not as obnoxious in their hostility towards a Dimitri Lascaris, a Naomi Klein, but when it comes to something like the Leap Manifesto, they're all talking about, well, how's that going to address deficits? And you can't really think that we can spend money to actually save the planet, right?
Oh man, it's like it's like you have basically
and then Justin Trudeau was given a complete free ride by the entire media, including the supposedly really liberal media like the Huffington Post, Vice, and stuff like that. Like it's like the media may not be as obnoxious as British media or American media, but you can definitely apply Chomsky and Herman's propaganda model to the CBC, the Globe and Mail, CTV, National Post, and the Toronto Star and so forth.
Yeah, 100% there. It's definitely one of those cases I find with the Canadian media. A lot of it is also misdirection and basically lying by, I would say, simply not covering things. That's how the Canadian media really does it. You see in the U.S., it's more blatant lying, but here it doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist. That's how they do it here, and it's just as bad.
Which is interesting because let's take I mean, briefly before I get into the next question, then, so let's talk briefly then about how the Canadian corporate media, state media, like like the CBC, TVO, TV Ontario. Okay, so when it comes to something like the plight of Indigenous people, uh, like has the history of Canada just been to actually ignore the plight of Indigenous people until Stephen Harper came, and then all of a sudden, Canadians acted as if the Canadian media acted as if they gave a shit about Indigenous people and made it out as if it was just, mean Stephen Harper.
I mean, I don't really think Canadians ever cared about basically Indigenous nations, or I don't think they ever have really. I mean, if they actually cared about it, you'd be covering land defenses. You'd be covering 1492 Land Back Lane. They would have been covering Wet'suwet'en. So really, if they would have cared about these things, you show it by covering it. And that's the biggest thing of how you manufacture consent in Canada is the media, I've said this before, plays an inherently activist role. You see there's this demonization of activist journalists or journalists who kind of have that activism, like, for example, Desmond Cole. But really, basically, the whole entire role of journalism is inherently a journalist picking what is important and showing people what they should focus on and what they should care about. And so it's just such a frustrating reality.
And how much does the Canadian nationalism, because we talked a little bit about left nationalism, like the waffles and so forth. How much does the we're not racist like Americans. We're a socially liberal paradise, unlike the Americans. We're the good cops in the world compared to the bad cops, America, Canada is just a liberal democracy paradise, and is actually a socialist paradise compared to the U.S. So how much does that sort of mild anti-Americanism and that constant we have a single payer healthcare system, like how much of that plays a role in how how the Canadian media omits the real issues of the day that actually affects Canadians on the daily basis?
Yeah, I'd say basically this anti-American nationalism really is a foolish folly because I mean, yes, obviously America sucks. Let's be real here, America sucks. And yeah, but I think really like this idea of obsessing over America and not getting a shit about Canadian politics, I think is obviously I think it's the biggest excuse used by our media class. It's just train your eyes over here, ignore what's happening in your own place. Basically, it's one of the most frustrating things really because you could say the media should learn, but I don't think it's so much learning as it's intentional. I mean, like this is more of an anecdote, but I remember Nora Loretto basically would kind of keeps an eye on CBC, The Current, fairly often. It's always like talking about America or talking about American policing or talking about American issues. And basically, like this is instead of talking about Canadian police brutality or basically issues as such, like genocide against Indigenous peoples. You really have a media environment that is it's almost brilliant in its like silent toxicity.
Yeah.
It really works to destroy these social movements, but it does it in like a clandestine way.
And but in how awful then is the education system then in Canada, because people must go to school and they must be taught, if not in great detail, about the apartheid Indigenous people face, and and the slavery that Black Canadians face. And of course the fact that Canada was an extension of the British Empire. So does the education system then in Canada just not talk about the real history of Canada? And if it is, it's always in a positive light. Like we fought in World War II, we fought in World War I. We were always the good guys in those imperial conflicts, and that evil only started when it was Stephen Harper.
Yeah, you pretty much hit the nail on the head there. you really have basically just Canadian media and Jesus Christ. You know what? I blanked on the question. Please just go through the question again.
Oh, that is the Canadian education system. Like,
okay, I got it. Yeah. Okay, yeah, no, the Canadian education system is, yet again, it really is an extension of just imperialism and supporting imperialism, colonialism, and genocide, really. No doubt there. I mean, in terms of like this, for example, slavery of basically black Canadians, really, in the past. I mean, I didn't know about that till I got out of high school. They didn't talk about that at all. They barely talked about genocide against Indigenous people. I learned that on my own, probably around grade 11, basically, because they barely talked about it. They said it was the way it is. Oh, we did some bad things, but it's okay now. That was the way we were taught it. Basically, like the education system, the vast majority of it is propaganda to maintain the current system. I mean, that's really the role of the education system if you think about it in a capitalist society. It's to churn out workers who have the ideological beliefs that suit the current capitalist state and are going to challenge the current capitalist state as little as possible. That is the role of the education system, and that is what it does. It just reproduces propaganda and reproduces propaganda as Canadians. You know, one of the things I always found remarkably funny in a sad way is they always talk about critical thinking, think for yourself, look through some media. They're not teaching you critical thinking. They're teaching you critical thinking that'll help you in a job. They're not teaching you to critically think about the world or critically think about the economic system. Like socialism, you don't get taught about socialism in school. You don't get taught about basically like how like you have tons of Nazi officials going into the European Union or going into NATO, or basically, for example, like Nazi officials going all the way through basically the former West Germany, the part that was controlled by basically, obviously, the U.S. and Europe. But you don't get taught about these things where basically it's always, oh, basically, we defeated fascism, yay, it's over. Oh, colonialism's over, yay, it's fine, don't go look somewhere else. Oh, yay, let's just focus on 20 hours about some friggin' trapper or whatever, and some cute little story. And genocide? What genocide? What genocide? Genocide? Where? I don't see the genocide. You don't know. Just close your eyes. It'll go away. Bye. It's a joke. It's a fucking joke, really. Our education system is propaganda designed to keep this current system going. And I mean, it isn't inherently surprising, really, because, I mean, of course, capitalism isn't going to survive without propagandizing its own citizens. Like, really, if people understood what capitalism is, it gets overthrown. Or basically, you'd have severe repression. It would be the only way of keeping it, and you'd move to fascism. It's pretty simple. When people understand basically what capitalism is and they rise up against it, fascism is the automatic response of the system. Like, fascism is just a feature of capitalism when people basically manage to start breaking through the propaganda. So
yeah. But then, you know, when it comes to, you know, the whole left nationalism, you have people like Mel Hertig, people like like the Waffle Movement and so forth, and I like a lot of what Mel's criticisms of Canadian the Canadian economy, the political system, and so forth, but. Of course, he presents it as if Canada, once upon a time, was a was a great country, but the British, but we were an extension of the British Empire. There was a brief period of time where Canada was developing into a good liberal democracy, but then Nafta and the American system kind of penetrated us, and we became sort of like a colony of the America. So does a lot of that?
We were never a colony of America. We were never a good country. We never have been a good country, and quite frankly, until we overthrow the capitalist system, and basically we start to genuinely respect Indigenous nations and have them basically have the sovereignty that they deserve. Then, quite frankly, we're not going to be a good country. I couldn't despise that kind of argument, like from the kind of Mel Watkins and those type of people anymore. It's just an absolute waste of time, and it does a genuine disservice to people, basically, that are fighting for better and that actually grasp the reality of the situation.
Wow, that's interesting, and I think one of these days I think we're definitely gonna have to do a whole program about propaganda. It's been something I've been wanting to do for for a while, but yeah, let's get into this third question then, which is I never got the chance to ask Dimitri, Eve, and Jay Watts this question. So I'm going to ask you this question, and you can talk about how the media completely lies about this important issue, which is NAFTA. So can you talk about NAFTA? And because I never hear about the negative effects that it had on Canada, but we hear about the negative effects it had on American workers, Mexico. So can you talk about NAFTA, its effect on Canada's workers, and the socio-economic impact that NAFTA had on Canada, and go on from there.
I'll admit that I don't have the greatest knowledge of NAFTA in the first place. Admittedly, it's more been foreign policy focused. But I mean, the general sense I got from it was it did hollow out a lot of basically the industrial kind of industries. I mean, in Ontario, for example. But yeah, I'll admit I'm not going to pretend I have a ton of knowledge there. But I think we can obviously there's a huge problem in general with the free trade systems we have currently. And especially, I think like the investor state dispute clause, which was like secret courts, I think that might have gotten removed. But for example, it's just for me, I've always had huge problems with kind of these capitalist free trade deals because they're always premised on exploitation and really just propping up our ruling classes. So
and it's funny because talking about the left nationalists say that NAFTA makes us more into a colony of of America, and it's
it's just a lot of excuse making for Canada, and I don't have time for it really. Like, I think the truth is the left needs to fix the fuck up, and needs to fix the fuck up fast. And it needs to get over its delusions and get over itself and just move on. Like, we have a world to save. We have a world on the verge of we have a world in a climate crisis. We have a world on the verge of collapse, really. And you have to fix it the fuck up fast. You don't have time to feel sorry for yourself. You don't have time to feel sorry for yourself for being wrong, for making these mistakes. I made these mistakes. I figured out a lot of these mistakes. I'm still learning. But so can you. Like, just fix up, move on. We have a world to save, really. It's something where it's urgent. We need to move forward. We need to start changing. We need to start building mass movements.
And NAFTA and NAFTA basically empowers the oligarchs of Canada to not only destroy the working class in Canada, but to colonize further Mexico. So that being said, because you've talked a lot about how you have no time for social democrats and socialist reformers. So then why do you think AMLO isn't saying enough is enough? We are no longer going to be a colony of North America. I am ripping up the NAFTA deal. And hey, no deal, no problem, because I got a socialist revolution to build in Mexico. Buy America and Canada.
I don't know. I'll be honest to admit that Mexican politics aren't my expertise, but I think it's more, I guess it'd be fear of direct American invasion, potentially. That might be the logic of it, maybe. But I'll acknowledge that I can't jump around. But I've always got the sense that AMLO is probably like a kind of social democratic type, basically. And basically, I'm not gonna pretend I'm the best source for that, to be brutally honest. So.
It's interesting, and actually, we can even then go back to one of the issues when it comes to the Canadian media before I get into these last two questions I wanted to ask you, which was now I've actually watched Canadian Prime Minister debates from from when Tommy Douglas was running up against Pierre Trudeau all the way up until Justin Trudeau fighting for his re-election. So I've seen Canadian debates, how the questions are asked, And oh my God, if people think that that Canadian debates are better than American debates, I mean, okay, yes, to a certain extent they are, but but the issues are so narrow. I mean, there's no real talk about changing the system. It's all these like very boring conversations about deficits and deficits this and deficits that, and maybe one or two criticisms about NAFTA will come out from an NDP. They'll talk a little bit about Indigenous issues, but like for like one or two sentences. The parties don't really challenge themselves unless it's unless it's about very narrow socioeconomic issues. But yeah, can you talk about this obsession that the Canadian corporate media has and the politicians have about deficits?
Oh yeah, no, the deficit mongering is really just an excuse to basically, man, it's just quite frankly, it really is just an excuse to direct attention away from a lot of these issues. I mean, if you look at the Bank of Canada, really, again, I'm referencing something else, but it's a great documentary, which it has a bit of a goofy kind of like design and kind of like videography, but it is a good one on like the Bank of Canada in terms of power, in terms of how we basically this bank it essentially helps the big banks basically profit off of Canada where it really isn't necessary. Basically, like quite frankly, the Canadian bank could basically fund a lot of these things. Basically, we have the power to create currency and do these things. So I really find the deficit mongering to be frustrating, really, and because I mean, look, at the end of the day, also even if you look at the deficit, I mean, who are you paying? You're paying the rich. You're paying the big institutions. You're paying the big capitalists. You're paying the big 1%. So, quite frankly, the deficit mongering is utterly insane to me, and I think basically, yeah, that it just isn't legitimate. I mean, even Social Democrats can agree with me on that. That push for it is just, it really is stupidity. I mean, even on a basic, if you look at it through a social democratic lens, there's such an easy way, wealth taxes, a lot of these things. And if the rich leave, then fuck them. Like, if they want to fuck off, okay, bye. Just go. We don't want you. You're a damn parasite. Go.
Yeah, and then why? Yeah, then talk to me about these. Talk to me briefly about these two issues before we get back into foreign policy. Which is, why is there an opioid crisis in Canada, and does not having a pharmacare system, is that the reason why there's a big opioid the whole opioid overdose crisis? And is that also and then can you talk briefly about the epidemic of homelessness that apparently exists in Canada?
Okay, so opioid crisis is just flat out. That's not my area. Not my area. Like,
Okay.
admittedly, but I'd say in terms of homelessness, I mean, like the one point I can bring up is, for example, in terms of I guess it's more focused on media specifically, but I mean, the media doesn't give a shit about homelessness. It doesn't cover basically the mass evictions that are happening right now in Toronto. You have basically these like eviction boards that are essentially lasting 60 seconds and booting people out of their homes. You have basically a government, for example, in the middle of a pandemic that won't cut off rent costs, basically for ordinary working people. And so, I mean, my experience, I mean, I went and covered basically one of the interesting things is in the summer I went and covered the Afro-Indigenous Rising Collective, basically. And so it was one of those things where it was the first time, like, admittedly, I hadn't interacted with, I guess, houseless people would be the word most, but it's like having a chance to talk with them, either through their experiences. It had always been an issue that worried me, but I think basically being there, being part of the movement, and I mean, I think I could probably dedicate a whole like 30, 40 minutes talking about my experience covering that. But yeah, it's just an issue where it's enraging the fact that there isn't more being done. And I guess, yeah, I can't be the person that'll give the most specific answers on this. Admittedly, foreign policy is probably my expertise, but I will suggest basically you give Shelter Housing Justice Network. That's one I would suggest giving a look at, because one of my friends would say Anna Jessup basically does good work along with that coalition.
Okay, definitely interesting. And yeah, yeah, let's go back to foreign policy. And one of the issues that the Canada Files has been covering a lot is the anti-Chinese hysteria. I never thought we would live to see the day where China, where all of these capitalist ghoulish countries send their jobs for cheap labor over to China. All of a sudden, they all dislike China. All of a sudden, there's dangerous talks of war with China, building up our military against China, supporting separatists in Hong Kong. So can you talk to me about the anti-Chinese hysteria? Why do you think that is, and the disturbing trend? Because we see the NDP and the Green Party supporting this rabid anti-China derangement syndrome, and I say this as a guy that's not even a fan of the Chinese system, but I don't want war and I don't want to die from a nuclear holocaust.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's one of the things I think I've kind of focused on recently more, but I think it's been something I've been trying to keep an eye on for a while, really. Yeah, I think it's kind of like it speaks to the whole general like kind of left derangement around actually existing socialist countries and kind of like basically, yes, obviously it's not a socialist utopia in China, but it's building towards that. It's the whole idea of socialism with Chinese characteristics. In its first basic concept, basically, you have imperialist aggression against it from every single second of its history since the Chinese Revolution, really. And so you have it stretching to this modern day where you have basically the targeting of Huawei, where Canada is part of the Five Eyes network, and I wrote about this. Basically, the Five Eyes network in the U.S. exerts significant influence on Canada, even though obviously Canada controls its own foreign policy. Basically, but you have a case where Huawei and Canada is part of this. Basically, there's a whole campaign to force Huawei out of any of the Five Eyes networks. Basically, even though basically you see these, especially the network, doing far worse spying, basically, or there's actually no real proof that Huawei is doing spying. Basically, France and Germany, who used it, they never found anything there. And so I guess the core point, especially like you look at Hong Kong, where basically you have the National Endowment for Democracy, basically funding these protesters. I wrote something about this in July, where Demosisto, the resistance party per se, collapsed the second basically China banned foreign funding of basically these groups, where it's just pathetic, really. You have, I remember being called a fascist for basically for just being critical of basically the Hong Kong movement there, because once I actually saw it for what it was. Basically, yeah, I guess you could have a whole like 2-3 hour discussion on this, but I guess if I was going to bring it to some general points, I guess I would say that basically there's a lack of an understanding of North American incentives of having a Cold War. I think basically there's a lack of understanding of the foreign funding that's happening. I mean, look at Zhang Jing. Basically, the NEG just casually admitted in a tweet that it's been like 8.4 million. I think it was since 2004. But they're spending millions of dollars in a year funding these separatist groups, basically smearing them, basically funding propaganda. Someone like Adrian Zenz, who's a total idiot. Basically, like just the gray zone reporting is where I'd suggest people look at that. And the Canada Files had one article on that too, by William Dare. But you have like the key things really are basically you have really xenophobia. You have this rampant xenophobia where it's evil China, bad China, big China. China's going to rule everything. China wants to rule the world. It's going to do the exact same thing as the capitalism powers. Basically, then you have basically this derangement of lack of grasp of the fact that a lot of these so-called basically resistance movements or like kind of groups within China, obviously there are legitimate grievances with the system, and I think basically there's no doubt about that. Of course there is. Basically, and that's fair enough. But basically, you have basically these groups being funded to extend these differences and basically to purposely cause problems and basically try to destabilize China. And then I guess the final one, I would say, and I think maybe it plays into the first one, is just in terms of the social democratic political parties, really. And this is what I say about social imperialism: is they'll be woke with, I don't know, maybe Venezuela, they'll do something decent once in a while, or they'll maybe say something half decent about Bolivia, but you sure as hell better believe they'll jump all over basically the next rabid movement against China or the next rabid smear against China. It really is just basically like it's propaganda, and this is the biggest target of propaganda, basically in general. It really is basically China right now is being severely targeted for a Cold War effort, and to justify a Cold War with them. So obviously, I've written a fair bit about that. There's some good writing out there generally, as well as also the gray zone. So I definitely suggest people go through, read and look through this issue because it's a really, really important one. And I say it's probably one of the most important issues of our time because we are really being driven towards a Cold War against China. And I mean, like, for example, you look at the case of Meng Wanzhou, and I wrote about that. There's a massive smear campaign, even where you can clearly see the extradition case is fraudulent. It's based on illegal U.S. sanctions against Iran. So the case is based off illegal sanctions in the first place. And then there's not even real proof that she actually committed the crimes that were based off of, obviously, illegal sanctions. And so you have to see the Canadian state refusing to just send her back. And so, yeah, there's just a real general derangement towards China. And I mean, there's a specific episode of the Canadian Foreign Policy Files where we just focus on Canada-China relations. I would urge your listeners to listen to that because that goes through for about an hour and a half, and that gives probably the best possible explanation of the core and key of the issues between Canada and China.
Do you think one of the reasons why the propaganda against China has been so successful when we talk about the Hong Kong protests or when we talk about the issue of the Uyghurs, which we both admit that there are legitimate grievances that the people of Hong Kong have. There are legitimate grievances the Uyghurs, Tibetans, and even Taiwan has with China. We're not denying that, but I think maybe but do you think that the reason why that one of the reasons why so many supposedly left-leaning people and their parties are supporting this ridiculous pivot to Asia and playing a very, very dangerous game trying to destabilize China and trying to go to war with China is because of the thing that they use in propaganda, which is half-truths. So China has human rights abuses, but what they do is that they weaponize those half-truths and they weaponize the legitimate grievances that people of Hong Kong have with those half-truths, it goes from being something which is a little bit true to just full on propaganda, like the fact that the Hong Kong protesters, like, they're not these left-wing it's not like a left-wing people power revolution. I mean, much of the protests are reverse racists. Many of them just want Hong Kong to be like Singapore, and many of them would just like China to not even regulate a little bit of the
give me a quick second. I need to pop some. Just keep going.
Oh, can you still everything good? I can't hear you at the moment. Is it because of your? Oh. Uh-oh. Can you hear me, Aidan? I can't hear you. It looks like your microphone's muted. Yeah, your microphone is muted.
Going soon. Oh,
all good?
Yeah, I probably need to get going in about 5 minutes, I think.
Oh, so. Okay. Okay, then just to wrap up that question, yeah, do you think that the reason why the campaign against China has been successful is because of half-truths? Like the fact that, like, that there is issues in China, but they're weaponizing those issues to full-on fake news.
Look, I don't know I don't think we'll exactly agree on the extent. I don't really think there's that many human rights abuses, or there's certain, like, there's obviously a degree, like, you think about it in terms of like dictatorship of the proletariat. So there's going to be some repression, obviously. You have like capitalist elements or some of that. That's inherent to basically when you have imperialist powers pressing against it, you have to have inherently some repression. So no doubt there's some repression there, basically, but that's kind of like inherent to basically keep the system in place there. But yeah, no doubt there's some stuff. I'm not going to pretend that there isn't, but yeah.
Okay, well, but I think we can both agree that it's very dangerous. It is very dangerous,
Yep.
these war games that they're doing with China, and we have to, and that's why the Canada Files is so important. So do I have time to give do I have time to ask two last questions then, or do you have to go now?
What questions are you going to ask?
Okay, then. Well, okay. So the last two questions I want to ask is, what are you? So the last two questions I want to ask is, what are your reflections on the campaign of Meryam Haddad and Dimitri Lascaris, their leadership bids of the Green Party? I just wanted to know, like, your reflections on that. And then the last question I wanted to ask then was just your thoughts on the Canadian Black Lives Matter movement sort of merging with the Indigenous Lives Matter movement, and just what are sort of your thoughts on that, because it seems to be a very optimistic thing that's happening in Canada in response to the whole in response to George Floyd and the epidemic of police brutality in Canada.
Yeah, sure. That'd be fine. Basically, I probably anyways would have fairly quick answers to them, but yeah. So feel free to go into that. Yeah.
Yeah. So just quickly then, what were your thoughts on the campaign of Dimitri Lascaris and Meryam Haddad running for the Green Party? Yeah.
So for me, I think basically. I almost think the greatest benefit of it was more so people realizing the kind of shortcomings and essentially failures of social democracy. Really, I think that's going to be the biggest legacy of the campaign, because I think a lot of people, along with me, that it was like that was when they finally came to terms with what social democracy, where I knew what social democracy was, but then when you saw it in application for the final time, I think that's going to be the biggest legacy of it. For example, someone like Dimitri Lascaris, I obviously have respect for him. I don't think we'll agree on certain issues, but I have a ton of respect for him. No doubt there. He's done some great work. And I have respect for Meryam Haddad, too. She definitely does some great work. But I even think if they had gotten into power, I don't think they would have been able to do as much as they wanted to. And I think long term, I think that would have been more harmful to the movement, because it would have deluded people about social democracy for longer, when really you kind of need to get people to come to grips with reality. So.
Okay, and then the last question then I want to ask then is, your thoughts on the nationwide protests that have been taking place in Canada, first as a solidarity response to the murder of George Floyd, but in the protests in Canada you had the Canadian Black Lives Matter and the Indigenous Lives Matter movement sort of merge into one to speak out against institutional racism in Canada. And I just wanted your thoughts on, do you find that's a very hopeful sign to see, the Black Lives Matter of Canada and the Indigenous anti-colonial movements sort of starting to merge as one? Yeah.
I think it's very good. I think it's absolutely great that basically you see some social movements starting to collaborate. I mean, that's one of the things about the Communist Party that appealed to me, was that basically they wanted to, even with groups that don't exactly fully agree with them, create like a common front, create like a movement to oppose capitalism, to oppose colonialism. And so I think something like this is definitely a absolutely terrific step. And I'm like, the way I see it is I stand totally in solidarity with those two movements. Really, we need to basically respect and basically have Indigenous sovereignty be the dominant force. You need to basically end basically the attacks on basically Black life, on Black people, and you need to basically create a anti-capitalist, basically a socialist state that is going to actually respect, listen to, and fully implement the demands of these movements. So.
Yeah, definitely. I think I mean I tend to be quite pessimistic on the state of affairs in Canada. I tend to be quite pessimistic on the state of affairs in general. But one of the more hopeful things, which I think is going, which I think might be a bit of a light at the end of this dark tunnel, is the fact that in Canada. To see the Black civil rights movement starting to merge now with alongside Indigenous people protesting side by side with each other and saying to the Canadian racist oligarchy that your days of white supremacy are now are numbered, I think is one of the greatest optimistic signs. And I only hope that that happens elsewhere in the Five Eyes alliances, especially in America and in Australia and New Zealand, where the Indigenous people there are still treated like shit, and they're and then the road to justice for them is still still a long ways to go. But in Canada, that's a very very optimistic development that's happening though, with Black Lives Matter merging with the Indigenous Lives Matter.
Oh yeah, 100%. I think basically there's obviously so much room for improvement, but I think basically there is reasons for optimism, and I think basically it's just you have to basically embrace the fight. It's going to be one where there's going to be a lot of losses, there's going to be a lot of pain, but if you succeed, the world's changed forever, and that's the biggest thing. Is basically you're not going to win right away. You're not going to win in any easy way. There's no point in taking the easy route or shortcut, i.e. social democracy, and a lot of these things that basically will only temporarily basically ease the class contradictions. You have to just go for the throat. You have to go for the throat of the capitalist system, or else you will be viciously crushed. So.
And then the last question, and then one final question. Is with the development of the Canada Files, do you see that that it's starting to have an impact on people in terms of finally getting rid of this nonsense that Canada's a force for good in the world? Like, do you think do you think that in terms of the Canadian truth-telling, myth-busting movement, the Canada Files is already having an immediately positive impact on the Canadian public?
Yeah, I think so. For sure, really. I think it's definitely had way more of an impact than I possibly could have expected when I started. I mean, I believe I have around 280,000 article views within just a little bit more than a year. So I think it's definitely reached people. And one of the most exciting things for me is looking at it was in terms of basically people visiting the site, it was around 190,000, basically people that visited the site, basically individuals. So I know at least 190,000 people visited the site in total. And that's one of the best things is people are starting to see this and people are starting to become aware of reality. And I think basically that's part of the reason why I'll keep pushing and keep doing the work so hard, basically because even if it's a lot of the work that other people don't want to do, I view it as absolutely invaluable. So.
Well, keep on doing the brilliant work. I know that you have to go right now, so we were joined on this edition of.
Oh wait. There's a few things I should probably plug before, so can you give me a chance to do that?
Yes, yeah. Go right ahead.
Okay, can you give me a little intro to that?
Okay, well, we were joined on this edition of 1+1 by Aidan Jonah, but before we leave, Aidan has some things that he wants to plug. So the floor is to you, Aidan. Again.
Okay, thanks. So first of all, Twitter, it's Aidan in the lower dash Jonah. If you want to follow me on Twitter. Facebook is just Aidan Jonah. In terms of basically, I have a Patreon to support myself personally. It's patreon.com/Aidan Jonah, no spaces there. Obviously, financial support is appreciated, and I made sure to obviously put benefits. I'm not going to ask for money for nothing. But in terms of if you want to support me individually, that's there. In terms of the Canada Files also has a Patreon. Patreon.com/thecanadafiles. Now, this is the whole goal is that money is specifically going to go to contributors and running costs. That's why I created my individual Patreon, because I want to separate the two so there's less confusion there. So if people want to support both, that's terrific. If people want to support one, that is still just as terrific. And in terms of the newsletter, we have a newsletter. Basically, so you go on the site, you'll see a link to the newsletter right when you come onto it. Please go sign up for that. We have around 600 people keeping an eye. We have a daily newsletter there. And one last plug, I am eventually going to start streaming on Twitch because there's supposed to be a weekly live stream for the Canada Files discussing Canadian politics and foreign policy of the day. So it'll be on my Twitch account. It's twitch.tv/Aidan Jonah. So go follow me there. Had some technical issues first time, but those should be sorted out, and hopefully I'll be able to, now that I'm done exams, I'll be able to stream there at least like once or twice a week.
Yeah, and I'm going to make sure to link to, I'm going to make sure that in the show notes and in the pins comment section, I'm going to make sure to link to, to all of that. And folks, yes, I strongly recommend if you loved, all of the appearances of, of Eve Angler, who is also a contributor to Canada Files. You can do no better than to subscribe, and if you do have the money, whether you're from Canada or not, donate generously to it. So Aidan,
Oh, one last thing. Check out the Canadian Foreign Policy Files. Long-form podcasts, key foreign policy issues of the day. Basically, you won't want to miss it.
Yeah. Well, Aidan, thank you so much for joining us. Yes, we're approaching the weekend, so have a great weekend. And have a very Merry Christmas or whatever is your holiday celebrations. Happy holidays, and definitely need to have you back on the show. We are going to have you back on the show because there's so much issues that we do need to discuss. Especially, I had no idea that you were a member of the Young Communist League, so we're definitely going to have have you back on soon. Then.
All right, thank you so much. It's been terrific to discuss with you, and I think it's definitely a lot of fun. These issues need to be chatted about, and so I'm glad that you're doing that.
Likewise, I really respect the work you do, and power to the people, death to the capitalist fascist pigs.
100%.